Good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I direct the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Very warm welcome to our last but one event of the year. And today we will discuss migration in and out of Central Asia. We are used to see Central Asia as a supply of labor migrants to Russia. Usually I show my students a map of migration, and these are arrows going north from the region to Russia. Now, in the aftermath of Russia's full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the situation is more complicated. We see kind of diversity of arrows. In addition to these traditional arrows going north, we see something unprecedented, something unexpected. Let's put it this way. We see a substantial migration of Russians to the region, and these are not only ethnic Russians. There are also Russian citizens from other parts of the country, and some people from Russian Asian republics, and they and Central Asians kind of rediscover affinities, which I think create some interesting processes. We also see some redirection of labor migration from Russia, and there are Central Asian migrants now working in Europe, and the numbers are growing. So interesting processes are going on, and we that's why we called our webinar Central Asia New Center of Mobilities. So we'll discuss about this changing situation with migration in and out of Central Asia and the implications of these new trends. And we have an excellent panel with us today. I'll introduce our speakers in the order I'll ask them to speak. We will start with Dr. Kara Schenk, who is our go-to expert when we discuss issues of migration. She's an associate professor of political science at Nazarbayev University, with teaching and research expertise in the politics of immigration and national identity in Eurasia. I want to flag the book published by Dr. Schenk in 2017. It's called Why Control Immigration: Strategic Uses of Migration Management in Russia. Thank you very much for joining us, Karas.
Thank you.
Then we will go to Ekaterina Vorobyova, who is a doctoral candidate and an EU researcher at the Research Center for East European Studies at the University of Bremen. Prior to her PhD studies, she worked on several research projects on forced migration, transnationalism, and migration entrepreneurship. Her doctoral dissertation is devoted to the largely overlooked topic of migrant entrepreneurship in Russia. And I'm also very happy to note that Ekaterina is currently a fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Thank you, Kata. Our last but not least speaker is Giulio Benedetti, who is a PhD candidate at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, and a Marie Curie early stage researcher in the Horizon 2020 funded International Training Network markets. His research focuses on informality and migration in the post-Soviet space. Currently, he focuses on the case of Central Asian truck drivers working in the EU and on the role of intermediaries of migration. Very warm welcome to you, Giulio, as well. So without further ado, let's go to you, Karis. Let's look at the big picture. How does this new migration flow fit kind of into the theory of migration?
Yeah, thanks so much, Nargis, for the introduction and for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about this, I think, really important topic. There's really quite a lot of different waves of migration that the war has caused, and all of them are interesting in their own right. I'd like to focus a little bit on the migration of Russians out of Russia into Central Asia, not only because this is the wave that has most affected the world that I see every day in Kazakhstan, but also because it's really theoretically unprecedented. So I want to talk a little bit about theory, migration theory, and then I also want to talk a little bit about migration or national identity in Kazakhstan, kind of the ripple effects that this migration wave has had on people in Kazakhstan. So I don't tend to focus on a data-oriented picture in terms of numbers of migrants, because I think when we focus on a sort of numerical picture of cross-border flows, we lose more than we gain. So I don't have nice charts and pictures of, the numbers of migrants that we've seen going across borders. Certainly the numbers are imperfect. This is not controversial. The bigger problem with taking a numbers-based approach, though, is that when we focus on numerical data, we really obscure some of the underlying social factors, social forces, human factors, human stories. So rather, I want to kind of focus on the social sentiment that bubbles up into the social scene that can't be ignored, and using that as a sort of impetus for what becomes important. But so usually when we talk about migration flows, we talk about push-pull factors, what makes migrants move from one place to another. The migration literature is really biased towards Western, developed, democratic receiving states. So migration theory tends to predict that migrant flows will be directed from lesser developed to more developed countries, and also former colonies to former colonizers. So think things, the flows like Algeria to France or India to the UK. But the Russians leaving Russia to find refuge in places where they formerly committed genocide, thinking famine in Kazakhstan, this really turns migration theory on its head. So we don't really have a lot of good theories to help us explain or that could have helped us to predict this type of migration flow. So on Twitter today, I saw that there was groundbreaking new research revealed that uncovered that democratic and non-democratic receiving states are equally restrictive towards migrants. But this is actually not particularly groundbreaking, because migration policies have always been more complicated, far more complicated than what we can explain by a variable like regime type, democracy or autocracy. Even though migration theory has long been trying to find explanations that really fit this sort of pattern. For those of us that are sitting in Eurasia, we know that the countries that we study don't fall so neatly into those democracy or autocracy sorts of paradigms. In this case, what we see is that Russian migrants found a much easier time getting into Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, even Mongolia, than they did entering more democratic European destinations. And visa-free entry across these borders not only complicates the idea that free movement is an outgrowth of liberalism, it's also a colonial legacy. So if we call the Commonwealth of Independent States and Eurasian Economic Union legacies of the Soviet Union, in this case, then the migration flows are really a legacy of these colonial relationships, except that they facilitated, in this case, movement from north to south rather than south to north, like migration theory would predict. Why is this colonial impact or angle important? I would argue that the greatest impact of Russian migration on Central Asia relates to the sort of decolonial identity process that it has facilitated. I'll unpack this in just a minute, but I should also say that the hundreds of thousands of Russian migrants fleeing first the war and then the mobilization has really had various impacts on Central Asian countries. While there are common impacts in terms of things like visible presence of Russians in public spaces, increased demand for public services, government services like registration or tax ID numbers, things like demand for, internet or things like this. There's been a kind of a common effect of driving up rent prices. These things are really felt across the region. But despite similarities, each country, and actually probably each region, we shouldn't stop at the country level, because there's so much within country variation in all of the Central Asian countries in terms of attitudes, values, economic development. We really see that that different places are experiencing the migration wave differently. And I think that these differences demonstrate a great deal about where communities sit vis-a-vis a number of politically and geopolitically oriented questions. Questions like, how will communities reckon with the past and the continued relationship with Russia, both economically, politically, in terms of things like memory, in terms of national identity, and what will these future identities look like? And these questions really cut across geopolitical alliances, across economics, and they really get at a more existential level of how citizens identify with the world around them in an everyday political way. And I think it really, really varies from country to country and region to region. So let me focus on Kazakhstan because it's the case that I can speak a little more most directly to. So in Kazakhstan, the coming of Russians catalyzed a very long-standing conversation about language and identity. The conversation was revitalized and, most importantly, popularized. So if activists and scholars have been discussing decolonization for a long time, and the government had its national identity project all the way back since independence, now the question of what it means to be Kazakh, and not only Kazakh, but German Kazakh and Kazakh Ukrainian and Kazakh Russian and Kazakh Uyghur, all of these types of Kazakh. This conversation has made its way into the public discussion in completely new ways. And I think this demonstrates a sort of democratization of the social media space in Kazakhstan, or just the phenomenon that social questions are being discussed in public places for the first time, maybe ever, on this scale in Kazakhstan. So in Kazakhstan, the issue of identity is centered on language, which is not really surprising since language has always been a contentious issue in Kazakhstan. One of the interesting questions, though, that I think really captures the tension in the current context was really made kind of sharp for me when I was at a panel of ESCAS in Almaty a couple months ago. And the panel was focused on creating safe spaces for queer communities in Astana and Almaty. But this community really represents activists that are on the forefront of thinking about identity and inclusivity and all of these things. And the question that they really focused their discussion around was how to create inclusive spaces that are decolonial when some of the community doesn't speak Kazakh. So in other words, how can we promote Kazakh language and really as a decolonial sort of effort, while still recognizing the reality that many people's Kazakh language is not dominant or equal to their level of Russian. So this is a question of kind of aspirational symbols of language use versus practiced realities, and how can we recognize both? And I'd like to say that our students are doing really interesting projects that are engaging some of these important issues on decolonial work. So we were having a conversation earlier today in PhD proposals where students are thinking about language hybridity and language fluidity, and how these spaces of decolonial language aspirations are not so pure in practice. Nevertheless, the contention around the language issue in Kazakhstan, whether speaking Kazakh is the best way to express your Kazakh identity, is really, really quite contentious and vibrant now. Let me just say a few final words on the government level. At the government level, you have really quite an ambivalent approach to identity that I think reflects a similar orientation towards the war and Russia in general. So recently, the government asked the diplomatic community to stop using Kazakhstani and refer instead to the government or the state or the population as Kazakh. And I think what this is aiming to achieve is a more broad and inclusive idea of what it means to be Kazakh, that everybody is Kazakh. Instead of everybody is Kazakhstani, everybody is Kazakh. But given the quite distinct categorical rhetoric of Kazakhstani as citizenship and Kazakh as ethnic up until now, this rhetoric is actually a bit confusing and actually quite potentially problematic depending on how it's seen by the population. And the problem comes that this shift from, using Kazakh towards using Kazakh as an inclusive term comes without distinct messaging. And this is actually what is similar to the way that the government is talking about the war, that there's pretty clear indications that the government is not in support of the war, and yet it remains very entangled with Russia. And the government is very, very reluctant to make distinct statements to the effect that, of where they stand in the war. So the question is where this ambivalence, whether this type of ambivalence will be able to keep up with the public discussion, which is really quite vibrant and becoming more nuanced, or whether public discussion will surpass the fairly limited ideational landscape that the government is setting out, creating realities on the ground that the government really might not be ready for. This is a really major question going forward. But to circle back to migration, while many migrants have actually left Kazakhstan, some were only passing through, some stayed for a little while longer. Some indeed have stayed and are integrating or not integrating. And so the landscape is quite still ongoing. There's a lot still that needs to be researched. The intensity of the discussion as it relates to migration has kind of died down a little bit. It's a little bit more kind of, it's not so intense, but the discussions that the migration wave has catalyzed, I think will be around for a long, long time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Karis. Can I ask you a couple of follow-up questions? Well, you said that this migration is unprecedented, but as an expert on migration, do you have any cases of migration in mind that had some, similar features? When people would not leave, would leave because of the, kind of some big political upheaval, and they didn't plan to move before, but they kind of moved in big numbers. So what cases do you have in mind? And the second question would be, well, it is different from the typical north-south migration, where people kind of had this plan to do so, and there are kind of strong incentives to move. Here, the kind of people had to flee, basically, right? And kind of what can we expect down the road? Do you shall we see it as a temporary situation, or you would think that in Central Asia there are other also kind of circumstances that can make it, kind of not a temporary migration, because there are some, well, it's easier to leave. There are cultural affinities, there are legacies that you mentioned. Also, these are emerging markets. There are jobs, unlike kind of the situation in the West, where there are very kind of the labor market is so tight, and if you want kind of more professional jobs, it's really difficult to do so. And whether there is a diversity inside this Russian migration kind of group, right? At the beginning, I mentioned Asian republics like Buryats, Yakuts, kind of they might see the situation somewhat differently. And if you can be kind of give us brief answers, that would be great. And then
Sure.
we'll move to...
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. So let me just start kind of backwards and move forward. So in terms of Asian Russians moving to Kazakhstan, one thing is that they have had a little bit of easier time integrating on the one hand. On the other hand, oftentimes they're dissidents, or there's a big group of Asian Russians that are dissidents, that are vocal kind of decolonial voices. And they have found that they aren't really adequately protected in Kazakhstan. And so you see a big community of these moving to places like Poland. So there's a big community of Asian Russians in Warsaw. So, I mean, this kind of goes both ways in terms of everyday people might find easier time integrating in Kazakhstan, in places like Kazakhstan, whereas dissidents would not find the protections that they need because of the government and its alliances and all of that. In terms of kind of futurescapes, it's really hard to know, right? Like the longer the war lingers on, the longer Russia kind of continues on its path, the more permanent these migrant waves are going to be. And I think that for what I see among people that have moved to Kazakhstan and decided to stay is they found that it's not so bad, right? It's not so bad in Kazakhstan. This is actually a pretty nice place to settle. And I think those people that are able to integrate, those people that are able to find jobs, find that that there's a community that is quite welcoming of them. So I think that there are pockets of space for them to integrate in the places that they've landed. I'm not sure if that's as true in places like Mongolia or Tajikistan. I really just don't know. But I do think that getting to your question of diversity of migrant experiences, absolutely, there's a lot of diversity. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of, figuring out what these comparisons actually mean. And the first question, I lost track of your first question. I'm so sorry, I didn't write them down.
If there are cases you kind of
right.
think
Yeah.
of,
yeah. So in fact, this is what's so puzzling is that there's it depends on what aspect you're comparing. So if you're talking about just like draft dodgers, certainly there's lots of draft dodgers, or certainly there's lots of political upheavals that have caused migrant waves. But those types of upheavals that have caused migrant waves to the places that you formerly colonized, that's a little bit different, right? And I'm not really sure. I mean, I talked about this with my migration scholar colleagues, and we really can't find a parallel case. So it really just kind of depends on what types of comparisons you want to make, and what aspects of the mobility that you want to isolate in order to make those comparisons. But like a really kind of perfect fit, we haven't found those. And I actually like to leverage the imperfection of the case with migration theory, because I think it really helps us to really lean into these colonial aspects.
Yeah, a very distant kind of case. I was thinking about that, but it's like really there are more differences than similarities. Is mainland China and Taiwan, and Kuomintang moving to Taiwan, and that's kind of But it's very different.
No, I think that all of these possibilities should be explored, and there's lots of we should definitely do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Katya, can we go to you and kind of zoom in on even more on the Russian migration to Central Asia?
I will share my slides. Yeah, can you see it? Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. I would like to share with you today some preliminary results of my ongoing longitudinal study, and in a way I will complement what Karas was talking about. So after the partial mobilization was announced in Russia in September 2022, I started collecting interviews with Russian reservists who had moved abroad. And every 6 months, I have contacted them again, and we discuss the changes that happened in their lives. So, and at the moment, I'm completing my third round of interviews with them. Some of my interviews moved to Central Asia, namely to Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan was one of the most popular destinations for Russian reservists because of visa-free regime, good transport connections, the use of Russian language, and so on. And we know that, for example, out of 1 million Russian reservists who left the country, around 400,000 entered Kazakhstan, but only a quarter, or around 100,000, stayed in Kazakhstan by mid-November. And longitudinal interviews that I have collected can provide us with some insights into how actually their situations were changing over time. So today I would like to focus on two aspects. They're interrelated. So it's basically the change in their attitudes towards Kazakhstan, and the change in the purpose and meaning of their migration projects. So it can be said that the feelings of Russians towards Kazakhstan have become more and more ambivalent with the passage of time. So they have changed from basically positive surprise to a limited satisfaction over the year. Immediately after immigration, Kazakhstan was experienced more as a place of exceptional hospitality, or even as a place of old moral values lost in Russia, such as tolerance and great compassion, respect for elderly and traditional families. All interviewees said that the Kazakhs were very friendly towards Russians, towards Russian language, and if there were some conflicts, they were exceptionally rare. And although Kazakhstan was perceived by almost all migrants as a transition point, after several months spent in Kazakhstan, many of them rediscovered the country as a place with great potential, actually, for the future. And one interview mentioned that it was in Astana where he made the greatest leap in his career for the last 10 years of his life. But over time, these feelings became more and more mixed. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, the social and economic environment in Kazakhstan is friendly and familiar and somehow comfortable. Another piece of the puzzle here, I guess, is informality, right? So informality is crucially important in the post-Soviet space. And it's practically difficult to do anything without it. So informal practices in Kazakhstan are quite similar to those in Russia. So, for example, you can turn to the black market to obtain certain documents that you need. You can engage in informal employment or in unregistered entrepreneurship. So knowing how to get things done provides certain level of comfort. But on the other hand, this similarity with Russia is repulsive to many of the migrants. So they moved out of Russia to seek the difference or to seek the positive change. And Kazakhstan can only satisfy this need to a certain extent. So interviewees cited corruption, political instability, weak legal institutions as familiar but repulsive factors in Kazakhstan. And as a result, even those who remain in Kazakhstan fantasize quite often about moving somewhere else, so usually to Western states. And this decision to stay longer in Kazakhstan was also motivated by other factors, which have to do with family reunions. So the Russian reservists are young men in their late 20s or early 30s, which means that quite many of them already have families or have partners, some have children. So as expected, some of these Russian men were joined later on by their families, by their wives, by their children. And this has made the entire household a bit less mobile. So because now they need to account for several parties, right? So for interests of several people in the family. For couples, meeting the needs of two or more family members, it's a constant balancing act. So especially when both spouses are in quite precarious financial, professional, and psychological situations. And partly as a result of this increased immobility and these growing routes in new destinations, we can observe how the purpose and the meaning of the migration projects also change. So we can say that as the time goes by, they are transformed from relocanti, as they are sometimes called, right? So to emphasize the temporary nature of the migration, into full-fledged traditional immigrants who don't expect to return back to their country of origin. Over the months, the primary reason for this immigration was often changing in their narratives from seeking safety to seeking self-development. So, for example, one interview mentioned security issues as a primary reason for motivation in the first interview. Then he mentioned fear of closed border in the second interview, and later on in the third interview, he mentioned better career prospects abroad. So we can see this kind of dynamics and change in the meaning of the projects. And these new narratives also dramatically change their relationship with Russia, right? So Russia is no longer the homeland they dream to return to. For them, it's just rather the starting point of their self-development journeys now. And if at the very beginning they stated that the end of mobilization, the end of the war, or maybe even the change of political regime in Russia can make them return, now, 1 year later, they have difficulties to name any conditions under which they're ready to do so. They see Russia more as an option for residents, but only hypothetically and not realistically. So we can see how the center of gravity of their lives slowly shifts from Russia to their new places of residence. So I think I will stop here, and yeah, I will be happy to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katya. Do you have the kind of, could you give us an idea what share fantasize about moving to the West, and what share of your respondents kind of think that they will stay in the,
almost all of them, actually, all of my interviewees, they plan at some point to move somewhere else. But of course, practically, it's very difficult to do so because they were joined also by their families, and now you need to find employment for your spouse also. So, and I don't know how it will develop in the future. So they continue postponing basically the decision to move somewhere else because of all the circumstances. So it's, yeah.
And what's your sense, having a family that's a factor kind of that pushes them to move, which would be in line with the traditional, right? I guess theory, you want better chances for your children and all that, or it's the other way around, that moving with the family is actually more difficult, and there are there are kindergartens, there are schools in the region, and children can kind of learn local language, but also Russian language, so it's easier to maintain cultural identity. So I don't know if it came up in your research.
I feel like it's more difficult to move as a family, of course, because now if you move to another country, so everyone should learn the new language. So it's very difficult, especially if you have like one of my interviewees, he has 3 children, so it's a bit difficult to.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let's go to Julia. So while some people are fantasizing about going to the West, some Central Asians are actually going to the West to work. It is kind of an interesting and maybe not fully new, but the scale is definitely the increase in the scale of this migration is something new. So Julia, what are your findings? The findings of your research?
Yes, thank you, Nargis, for the invitation and for the nice introduction. And thank you all for joining. I will share my presentation. So my research is actually about intermediaries of migration, but for this presentation, I will try to focus on most empirical side that I can. So as we were saying, migration from Central Asia to the European Union is on the increase. We can see even from COVID time, so from 2020 to 2022, which is the most complete data we have. Resident permits issued to citizens of Central Asia actually more than doubled. So we are talking from 75,000 to 150,000. It's clearly not something comparable to migration that is still going to Russia, which is in the millions, but it's very rapidly increasing. And this is also combined with other diversification of routes. We know that there are also popular destinations, some destinations that are becoming more popular, which are like South Korea, for example, Turkey, some Emirates also. But Europe is also taking a sort of lead in this. As we can see from data, there is a stark increase, especially in Germany. We can see also Poland and Lithuania. And something that those countries have in common is even if it's not possible to explain this increase of migration with only one economic sector, but those countries have in common that they are very popular destination for truck drivers. So this is why this is how truck drivers are somehow spearheading this migration, which is also anyway going into construction sectors and agriculture. UK is not part of this picture because they have different data, but also UK is an increasing destination, for example. Not as big as Germany, but it's also part of the overall picture. So this is my sort of entry to the field. So I will talk a bit about the first strike of truck drivers that happened in between March and April 2023. It was a group of Uzbekistani and Georgians, actually, and they were striking in Germany. So I joined them for 1 week, kind of, a bit more. And it was a very interesting case somehow, because it's not so frequent to see strikes. And also it was the first of, there has been also a second strike. And I would expect that probably more might be coming on the road. So they were all employed in Poland, striking in Germany for some reasons I can explain better, but mostly logistical. All recently immigrated, which is very common among truck drivers. Usually they don't have more than 2 years experience in 2 years, now 3, but experience in Europe. And they are coming essentially because there is a promise of competitive salaries. So we are talking something which is consistent when consistent amount when turned back to Central Asian currencies, and there is high labor demand. So it's relatively easy to get a job in the sector. But there are very serious systemic problems in terms of lack of accommodation, which means that truck drivers usually are asked to sleep in the trucks for months, even like 6 months, which is illegal, but happens. Very, very quite, I mean, pretty much the norm in which I encountered. And also health insurance is not very much, and parkings, it's also a very old problem, which is, not finding a place where to stay at some point. And there are also very firm-specific problems that were the ones that triggered this particular strike, which was withholding of salaries, imposition of arbitrary fines, and racism, racist attitudes. This was the case of this firm, but I encountered also in other, many other actually, interviews, because after the strike I also went on doing interviews with Kyrgyz truck drivers, and problems were pretty much similar. And these firm-specific problems, I have to say, they are specific to many firms, not only this one. At the end, they won, which was a very interesting thing also, because it's not so common either. And they were not really sure to win at the beginning. Then in the second strike, there was another group of workers went to strike like 1 month ago, and it was a bit different, and they also won actually. So quite quickly on how drivers migrate. Usually they find information on the internet, they find a job offer in Europe, they get in contact, receive an invitation, then they have to obtain a visa in Central Asia, usually in Almaty, and then they reach the companies based in Europe and they start working. Information is found mainly on the internet. There are a lot of ways to get information, not only companies' websites, but also TikTok, Instagram, and also there are expanding WhatsApp and Telegram groups where people share information. This is also a way to get in contact with intermediaries. And intermediaries are usually either companies, agencies, that offer the service of organizing migration, obtaining documents, or also experienced individuals. Prices might also change from 600 to 2,000 euros usually. Usually people who get to intermediaries are either older ones or first timers, but there is also demand for this kind of service. Intermediaries, and this is one part of the research I'm not going to talk too much, but they are very intertwined with social networks. So it happens very often that people ask for information in Telegram channels, for example, and people either give the information for free, which is very normal, or maybe they say, okay, if you still have problems or you are unsure, you can contact somebody else. So there is somehow to discuss a bit the opposition in migration theory about intermediaries or brokers or traffickers sometimes, and good social networks, while in this case they are very much intertwined. Distribution of the resources. This is, if we look at the relation with intermediaries, we can see that in this precise stream of migration, the possibility of intermediaries to be gatekeepers of the situation is kind of limited. And it's limited by the high demand of workers. So it's quite firms taking a lot of workers right now. Prospective workers have choice between intermediaries. They can choose different intermediaries. They can find information in different ways. And they usually have independent sources of financing. So they typically sell cars or land plots, or they contract debts for usually low interest debts. So in conclusion, again, the context makes intermediaries still requested. They offer a valuable service, but there is some balance because prospective migrants can actually they are not facing somebody who's a gatekeeper, but more often like some representative type of brokerage. Then there are clearly also abuses that happened. But in general, it's more perceived as a service than some kind of burden. This is all in the context of this infrastructure or migration. So sort of rules, institutions, logistical sides, and complexion of rules that it's being built. So it's also very interesting, I think, to observe how this connection between Central Asia and the EU is being established over time. So we are just witnessing kind of the beginning of this swallowing of the flow. Another thing is also that I'm hearing very often lately talk of USA as a next destination, because there was this idea of we are going to Europe where working conditions are better, salaries are better, and so on. Turns out that salaries usually are better, for sure, than Central Asia, but working conditions are not so different from Russia and other destinations. So there is this kind of talk going on about USA as the next El Dorado somehow, so the next hope in a sense. And I know there are already people who crossed also illegally from Mexico, working in the USA. And there is pretty much this talk of how to get into the US, which is not so easy to do legally. So there is this talk also influenced by this tendency that very often happen to show only the good part of your migration process back home via Instagram, TikTok, and so on. And this also influences prospective migrants who are thinking that the next destination is actually way better than the current one. And we'll see how it goes. Thank you for the attention. And that's it. If anybody wants to know more about the strike, I also write an article on Open Democracy and sharing a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulio. So this is, do you understand correctly that this is like legal migration, right? You mentioned getting visas in consulates, and is there legal migration as well?
Yes, I think that in the case of truck drivers, way less, in the sense that it's relatively easy to get documents. I actually had some interviews also with construction workers in Latvia and Hungary. In that case, I think the situation is way more linked to problems with documents, also having to pay high sums to get somebody to issue you an invitation. So I think that this is more connected to also shadow economy. In the case of truck drivers, it's pretty much easy just getting on a company site, downloading, like there is a form usually to compile, then having a short job interview, and then it's very
And are these
kind of quick.
temporary jobs or something like seasonal, or it's actually like you get a visa for a year or 2 years or something like that? Like how does it work on the visa side?
No, it's actually kind of long term. So people are working for many months, and then usually they might also take some breaks because again, as I said, the kind of norm is that people would sleep in the trucks for like 4 or 6 months, which is something feasible. I also slept in the trucks. It was like feasible, but you know, it's kind of heavy at some point.
Yeah,
So
not nice.
after some months, definitely you need some break and some better cloth and better meat. They also complain a lot about meat quality in Europe. They're not really happy. So there's also
Well,
this.
yeah, then maybe they shouldn't come here. But anyhow, okay, we thank you so much. We have 13 minutes for questions. Perfect, and we already got some really good questions. I'll go to, well, the first question is for Karis. Are Russian migrants sensitive or critical to the historical colonial relationship between Russia and their new countries, or to the current regional hegemony? Do they reproduce colonial attitudes as ethnic discrimination, their daily life? And also, is there anything on the positive side, like, there are these discussions about the Russian presence being good for the economy, right? And the professionals moving and like labor moving. So yeah, if you can address that.
Yeah, no, so certainly I think that there are these kind of imperial mindsets, or these sort of problems of whiteness that Russians bring with them that they have very unconsciously. So sometimes it'll be like, wow, I didn't know that Kazakhstan was so developed, right? Just these sort of naive expectations about Kazakhstan. And people in Kazakhstan are very sensitive to this, to whether it's outright criticism or it's surprise that Kazakhstan is actually quite developed, right? And all of these things. So in fact, one of the things that potential for Russian migrants to kind of deconstruct their colonial mentalities. And what we realized really quickly is that they weren't ready when we were ready to talk about it. They weren't ready they weren't ready to go there. But I think that the value of projects like Katya's is that we can kind of trace these things over time. And if we do follow-up interviews with our interviewees too, we might be able to start digging into that a little bit more. But at least at the beginning, it was really two too difficult to, they weren't really ready to talk about these things. We are exploring it a little bit, but it's really quite subtle, and it's a very painful sort of deconstruction of coming to terms with, you know, racism, colonialism, and these sorts of things. In terms of the positives, you do see, you know, talk about business development. It seems to me, and this could be just kind of a sort of not systematic sample maybe, that in Kyrgyzstan there's more focus on the positives, and in Kazakhstan there's more focus on the negatives, but that could be a little bit too painting in broad brush strokes. There is research on the business development and things like that. I did want to say one other really quick thing unrelated to this question, and that is to Julio, that actually there's a group of Uzbek truck drivers in Ohio that has developed over the last maybe 10 years. And they are doing some really interesting things that I think parallel some of the things that you're finding, even, you know, using the tax deferral. I think they have a year of tax deferral when they create a new company. So they'll create a company, operate for a year, shut that company down, create a new company to be tax deferred for a year. And there's a whole community of them in Ohio that's kind of branching out into other regions because they're truck drivers. And so this would be a really interesting comparison study, I think, for what you're looking at. But yeah, sorry to
great.
Thank
you, Karis. Katya, you mentioned repulsion with familiarity. By the way, what Russian word was used in the questionnaire, if you remember?
Russian words, so they said the same. То же самое.
Okay. And did they complain like that natives, well, you know, sort of continuing this colonial decolonization, the legacy, imperial legacy thing. Do they complain that, you know, kind of natives are lazy, disorganized, kind of unfit to work compared to Russians? Have you heard anything along the lines? That was a question.
Yeah, I didn't encounter that Russian reservists were very critical of local population. Actually, they were very grateful for all the help that they received from locals. So what they were critical of is mostly structural problems that are similar across post-Soviet space, right? So, and that's what caused them some dissatisfaction. But this dissatisfaction didn't come you know, from, for example, encounters with the local population. So I honestly didn't encounter this, what's called imperial ignorance, right? So, but definitely the surprise that they had can come from colonial thinking. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you. We have a question for Julio. What about East Asian countries like Japan and South Korea? It seems these countries also become popular destinations for migrants from Central Asia. And another question: what was the attitude of local drivers, Polish, etc., to the strike?
Yes, about East Asia, definitely. I'm not focusing on that, but I know that Timur Dadabayev, for example, wrote about that in more extensively. And I think, so definitely, in general, the main destinations right now, they are kind of Europe, which is not very covered right now by literature. USA also not very present in the literature. What is more present right now, it's more Turkey. There is Urimboyev, for example, Erliyev, who did some studies about Turkey. Arab Berber, it's a destination not very covered by literature. And then South Korea and Japan, which is Timur Dadabayev and some other people who wrote about that. Also about the attitude of other truck drivers. Hello, Antonio. It's nice to see you here. I can only speak for for the ones that I met personally. So during the strike, there were so the trucks were kind of in two waves, and people were going through because it was on a parking lot on the the autobahn, and so people were also stopping by, having a chat or something. So the ones who stopped by to show solidarity were actually very solidal, but it's not really a consistent finding because it's very biased in the sense that only the ones who stopped by or honked or showed solidarity were the ones who I could talk with or observe. So all the others, I don't really have data because they would just pass through and you wouldn't know what they thought about. So
yeah, speaking of data, a question for Keres and Karya. Where do you go to for data, more or less credible data on Russian, like the numbers of Russian migrants in Central Asia?
I mean, there's official sources. How credible they are is really difficult because the data, I mean, data is not so, there's just a lot of problems with data in Central Asia. And so I mean, that's one of the reasons why I just don't focus on the numbers at all. I mean, I think numbers are fine for a starting point, but I think that they're just not really, there's just a lot more interesting to look at than the numbers, because I don't think that we can really answer a lot of the questions that are relevant with a sort of quantitative approach. We just don't have that data depth or quality, especially in Kazakhstan. And then the problem, I think, gets even worse when you go to Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Data quality is really poor.
Katya, do you
Yeah,
do you
I'm also
you want to-
using
But-
using sorry.
Yeah, so the same, right? But what do you usually
Yeah.
check? Like the I don't know, like in Kazakhstan, that's the E numbers, or I don't know, anything like that.
Yeah, you can check EIN
Visa.
numbers, you can check registrations, you can check border crossings. The problem is that none of these data are given systematically. They're kind of just peppered into the media. And
Yeah.
so you can request the data from what, if you can figure out the ministry that's responsible for that particular data point, whether it's border patrol or Ministry of Internal Affairs or Migration Police, sometimes they'll give it to you, sometimes they won't. Sometimes when we get the data from the government, it looks really fishy. And we can't really explain why, because they don't attach their methodology alongside of that. And so you know, the best way to get the data is to ask for it directly, but it comes without context. It just comes as a table of numbers without any context.
That sounds familiar. I have two big questions that I want to throw on the panel, and we have like 3 minutes, 4 minutes for addressing them. And one is the kind of what medium long-term implications do you see of these, migration, new migration flows, or reformatted migration flows? And the second question is, what would you recommend to research to the upcoming, to the kind of young researchers? Which areas kind of you think, which questions think would need more attention and would be interesting to follow up? And you can choose any of these questions to address. And maybe I'll go in the same order. Let's go in the same order as we did this webinar. Keres, what 1 minute?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, like the interesting questions. I mean, you have two great examples of young researchers doing really amazing work, asking really interesting questions. So I'm really pleased that we're highlighting that. I think that some of the questions that are going to be most popular are questions around decoloniality and post-coloniality. Just exactly this question of, can Russians deconstruct their the kind of the sins of the Slavic past and all of these sorts of things, however you want to put it. Those questions I think are going to continue to be really popular. In terms of migration, looking at variations and differences across destinations, across experiences. Class has been a really important factor, I think, in differentiating like what migrants do, where do they go, how dissatisfied they are. And then I think in the medium and long term, we're going to shift from, you know, why migrants left to how migrants are integrating, because I don't see that this is going to be a short-term factor. I mean, in the Q&A, there was a question about migrants returning to Russia, and we do certainly see that there are migrants that are returning to Russia. But there's also a lot of migrants that are staying and are probably going to stay out of Russia forever unless something really dramatic changes in Russia. And so in that sense, we're going to need to look at integration in those new destinations.
Yeah, and that's something that I think that Katya mentioned in her, that's one of the findings, right? Katya, what's your take?
Yeah, I find the question that Kares mentioned fascinating. Yeah, I think that's the right direction. But myself, I find interesting maybe the questions of formation of Russian diaspora. That's what we couldn't observe before, I guess, right? So because Russians were mostly pretty not that interested in, you know, keeping in touch with other Russians, but at the moment, the new migration wave can actually help to maybe form some diasporas here, Russian diasporas here and there. And here we can observe basically the diaspora formation in process, which is, I guess, also another interesting thing to observe. Another question is also, I guess, that can be potentially interesting is the political transnationalism, right? So how Russians who moved abroad now will try to engage or influence our politics in Russia if they try at all, right? So yeah, those are very challenging methodologically questions to research, but I guess very important.
Very interesting. Yes, Giulio?
Yeah, so long-term implications, I'm not really sure yet. It's something that will have to be seen also because it's kind of some migration, especially truck drivers to Europe, is something kind of not really going into the usual migration theories, because first of all, it's not people who is usually planning to stay in Europe. And secondly, it's people whose job is particularly lonely. They live usually in the trucks, so they have very very thick social connections through internet, through chats, through video calls. So it would be also very interesting to see what kind of connections to what and what kind of interpretations arise from this kind of relationship with the destination. So it has totally to be seen. It's very at the beginning. About something which is interesting to see, I think my very, very personal opinion is that conditions of workers, processes pertaining workers, I find quite understudied in general in the post-Soviet space. So I personally find it very interesting. Then I don't know if it's something that other people find interesting, but I think that always very kind of struck by the lack of studies in this matter, which I think is a widely interesting, but again, very personal opinion. So.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think it was a very rich discussion. I personally learned a lot. So thank you so much. Thank you, Kares. Thank you, Ekaterina. Thank you, Giulio. And I also want to thank Laura Sargent, the Vicente events coordinator, for helping us with this webinar. And of course, thank you very much, the audience, for tuning in, and those who watched us on YouTube as well. Thank you. I want to flag the last event of the year that the program will have on Friday, this Friday, at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. We will talk about the Middle Corridor. and the assessment, the recent report that the World Bank did on the Middle Corridor, prospects of the Middle Corridor, the potential of trade, and so on. I think it's also a very, very interesting topic. Please tune in, and goodbye.